Pastor Doug, back again with another question. Today's question, pretty straightforward, is should Christians tithe? The answer is, well, sure. Now, a follow-up question to that might be, must Christians tithe? Are they forced to? Should they be compelled to tithe? I would argue no. And now this gets at a much deeper conversation and a very important question, and that is the relationship of the Old Testament law to the New Covenant. And there are numerous books throughout the New Testament, Romans, Hebrews, that deal directly with this. In classical Protestantism, the law is divided up into three aspects: civil, ceremonial, and moral. Now, when it comes to earning our justification, all three of those parts of the law have been fulfilled in Jesus Christ. We do not keep the law in order to be justified. And there's a whole book in the Bible about that. That's the book of Galatians. However, we do have the civil, ceremonial, and moral law. The moral law, those do's and don'ts of basic morality, those guide us in our sanctification. And the civil and ceremonial laws, such as, let's say, the food laws or sacrificing animals, though they show the holiness of God, they no longer apply to the church. Why? Because they've been fulfilled in the New Covenant. For example, the Old Testament explicitly commands us to sacrifice animals. Why do we not sacrifice animals on Saturday? Because the New Covenant tells us that Jesus is the perfect Lamb of God, the perfect sacrifice, and his death once for all on that cross is all that we need. Now, the civil and ceremonial laws still can be helpful guidelines in one's personal holiness, but they're not shown in the New Testament to be explicitly commanded, or in some cases, like again with food laws or animal sacrifices, they've been removed. I think tithing is in that category of civil and ceremonial. When you read in Leviticus, when you read in Deuteronomy about the notions of the tithe, they are to support ancient Israel, the Old Testament sacrificial systems. And you don't read in the New Testament, at least where I could find, an explicit commandment that Christians in the church must literally give 10%. Now, saying that, should you give generously to the church? Yes. We are called throughout Old and New Testament to give generously. And the most important thing the church does, of course, is the proclamation of the word, especially on the Lord's Day. And that should and must be supported. Now, if you want to give 10% as a guide, I think that's actually very helpful. I personally give 10%. I do tithe. But I do that out of my freedom, not out of legal requirement. And in this church, in the church I serve, we don't force people to tithe, though we certainly do encourage it. I think it's a good guideline. If you want to give more, that's fine too. The law is an important thing. And when we look at tithing, we do notice actually it goes back even before the time of Moses giving the law. And again, books like Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. We read in Genesis, one of the first references to tithing is actually Abraham tithing to Melchizedek, where it says in Genesis 14:20, and blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand, and he, Abraham, gave him, Melchizedek, a tenth of all. Melchizedek being a righteous and godly man, maybe an angel, maybe a pre-incarnate presentation of Christ. We can do another video about that later, but at the very least, a godly man. And so Abraham, long before Moses' law, gave it 10%. So, should you give generously to the church? Yes. Why? Because the church is commanded to worship God and worship on the Lord's Day. And that should be and must be supported. Should you give generously to the Lord? Yeah, absolutely. Is 10% a good goal? Sure. Do you have to give literally 10%? No. But the more you understand the gospel, I think the more generous we'll be with all our time and our treasure and our talent. Well, I hope that helps, and as always, Christ's blessing to be upon you and yours. Amen.